Sego, I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. My guest this week is Dina Gilio-Whitaker. But before we get into that, I want to take a moment to mention something that we usually don't include in the episode until the very end, and that is that we're on Patreon. If you like the work that we are doing here at Let's Talk Native, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. If you are already a Patreon supporter, I want to take this time to let you know that we greatly appreciate your financial support here at Let's Talk Native. A lot of time and effort goes into producing each episode, and every little bit helps. So thank you all so much. Now, on with the episode. Dina Gilio-Whitaker is an author, journalist, lecturer, and adjunct professor of American Indian Studies at California State University at San Marcos. She is also the policy director and senior researcher for the Center for World Indigenous Studies. Much of her work is focused on Native American studies, decolonization, and environmental justice. Her most recent book, As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice, From Colonization to Standing Rock, was released in 2019. She is also the co-author of All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, along with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Dina is a descendant member of the Colville Confederated Tribes, but makes her home in the lands of the Ahashiman Nation in what is now known as Southern California. Dina Gilio-Whitaker, it is great to have you join me on my program. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native, but I'm not going to probably tap into some of the areas that you are most known for. You know, some of your environmental justice work. Obviously, you co-authored the book with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, but I wanted to use some of your thoughts on, or to tap into some of your thoughts on. One of the things that I'm confronted with as I take on some of the mascot issue, especially with high schools, and one of the courses of action that these schools are trying to take to justify keeping these Native mascots, this appropriation, this mockery, is to suggest that they will make a bigger commitment to teach Native history in school. But even the idea of presenting, of frankly, white people presenting Native history, and again, defining us even further as objects of the past, as a people who no longer exist, is a problem. So, I mean, give me your thoughts on that kind of rationale or that kind of justification that these schools are trying to make in just to keep their mascots by offering this up as some sort of token gesture.
Well, it's kind of BS. I mean, it's pretty disingenuous because it's transparent. And that's, as you're implying here, that they want to do these tokenistic gestures in order to avoid making any kind of real meaningful systemic change in the education system's curriculum. And I imagine, and I mean, I don't have any hard data where these kinds of arguments are coming from. I imagine it's pretty, particularly pervasive there. But probably in the Midwest. I mean, we can predict some of the, the very conservative areas where people are resistant to change and really addicted to their settler narratives about things. Because let's face it, these kinds of conversations, force people to have to look at some really uncomfortable histories and have uncomfortable conversations. And it implicates them, it implicates their ancestors, it implicates what it means to be settlers on stolen land.
Well, it implicates their very existence, because much of the wealth that the current generations enjoy, much of that affluence is tied directly to the fact that a country was built, an economy was built on stolen land and slavery.
Yeah, absolutely. And but the thing is like you can't, the trains left the station, on this, like you can run, but you can't hide from this. And it's inevitable that that places will be called out and will be forced to change. Now, what kind of, how far they actually change, right? And how meaningful that change will actually be remains to be seen. But
Well, and how much kicking and screaming will go along with being forced to change. I mean, look, we have
right,
states that are mandating change. We have oftentimes, even when a school board votes in a majority to change a mascot, the repercussions within a community can sometimes be, pretty vitriolic. But I come back to some of the basics associated with the mascot issue, and much of it is tied to the inaccurate representation that they use for not only their imagery, but even the wording that they use, whether they use racial slurs like redskin or warrior or brave or whatever they're using, or the imagery. Oftentimes it's completely disconnected to the people who either are or were indigenous to the area. In fact, I've been fighting my old high school. I went to school in Cambridge, New York. That's where I graduated from high school. And they call themselves the Cambridge Indians. And they frankly right now are actually in a spot where the New York Department of Education made them withdraw a resolution to reinstate the mascot after it was retired. But when you ask somebody in Cambridge, well, who are these Indians that you're talking about? They can't even tell you. They can't. Do they mean Mohawks or Mohican or Hurons or Pequots? They can't even tell you. So when we hear some of this, well, we're only doing it to honor you, when they haven't even bothered learning who the native people are that they're claiming to appropriate for their own identities, they haven't even gone that far. And of course the imagery. We know that it's always, oftentimes been this Plains Indian headdress that didn't matter where in the country they used it. That's what they started with. Now there's been a little bit more sensitivity. If you look on the East Coast, you will find the same Eastern woodland native from the late 18th century, that imagery used by 30 schools up and down the Eastern seaboard. So they still use these very stereotypical imageries for these mascots without any sense for who we were, and that doesn't even get to addressing who we are.
Well, it's just it's so these are dinosaurs. These are the people who are going kicking and screaming, and their days are numbered. Look what happened to Dan Snyder. After all those years, I will never change the name.
You can print that in capitals, or caps. Or whatever,
you can't help but laugh and love it that he has such egg on his face about that. I love that he is, he was so mean and so resistant to that all of those years, and finally, social pressure made him buckle.
Well, and financial pressure.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And all of those things combined, whatever it was still pressure in the social arena that forced him to change. At some point, it becomes untenable. Like if the trains left the station and the momentum is heading in a certain direction, and people are finally saying, we can't, we have to start listening. We all have to move forward together, and you are in the minority, because at this point, my perception of it is that those kind of people are in the minority. It's really not acceptable, and when you, talk about why is it, I mean, for me, the most powerful argument is that why is it acceptable to have the image of an Indian head in some kind of headdress, a disembodied Indian that is represents an image of a dead, extinct, person or culture? Why is that acceptable? But and to have a name like the Redskins or the Braves or the warriors with a related native imagery, but it's not acceptable to have a team called the Sambos. When you put it that way, then people like, there's nowhere to go with that conversation.
Well, I asked the question, if a school, and in fact, I posted this recently on Facebook, is that if a school, for whatever reason, decided they wanted to honor Black people with their native mascot or with their school mascot, what would they call them? And what imagery would they use? I mean, and if you find that an uncomfortable question, then you have to understand what's wrong with using Native people for a mascot. You know, the other thing I wanted to mention was, it's funny how many schools there were who relied on the backdrop of the Washington football team or the Cleveland baseball team, and how many of them say, well, the pro teams do it, so if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. And so we've heard that said over and over again. Now that these schools are left hanging because Dan Snyder and the Cleveland baseball team
They've lost that argument.
Well, exactly, and yet they're still digging in such a way that is, I mean, it just shows the level of hypocrisy.
Yeah, but it's going to become at some point untenable. And socially untenable. Is unacceptable. If you're bucking the tide, you're going to be seen as a just blatantly disrespectful. I mean, that's the only place this can go.
And you see people digging in such a way that it's that they run out of arguments. And so now this latest push, and look, one of the biggest problems we have is there are a few Native voices that get put up on pedestals. The few Native voices that are out there that are willing to say, "Oh yeah, we like this," and and this is what I ran into back in Cambridge, New York, and of course this organization that calls themselves the Native American Guardians Association, which most of those guys are frauds. But they've been pitching this educate, not eradicate. By the way, they spelled eradicate wrong in their filings. They spelled it with an IRR, which doesn't mean eliminate, but that's a whole nother issue. But I think they need to educate themselves. But this whole idea of pushing education as a solution to the mascot problem, when in the reality is this idea of adding more Native history to a school's curriculum is continuing the problem. It doesn't solve the problem whatsoever.
No, it doesn't. I mean, education. I mean, it sounds good on the surface. I mean, we've all been saying that for decades as Native people.
But there has to be the reasoning behind it is where the problem comes from. Because if you're saying the only reason you're doing it is to justify the racist act that your school has been continuing for 80 years. Yeah.
But again, there's that transparent, the disingenuousness of it being so transparent. But then they are in such a small minority that it's kind of a joke. Like, who takes them seriously except, the conservatives that rely on them? I mean, it's doomed to fail. It's going to fail. It is failing, and eventually it's going to go away. But
and the problem is you do have pockets of, like you said, conservatism. You have even here in New York, what is considered a fairly liberal state, you have pockets of real right-wing conservatism that digs in on this kind of thing. And the crazy part is the same people who will decry having to retire their mascots and they call it cancel culture. These are the same ones who would argue against teaching, well, even though it's not taught in schools anyway, but this idea of critical race theory. So if your view is you don't want to teach anything that's going to make white people uncomfortable, which is essentially the argument against critical race theory, what possible history would you entertain to teach?
Right. All the stuff that it just continues white people to feel good about themselves. Oh, look at, they sell, well, and you see those kinds of history texts, they're out there that celebrate achievements and look at how far we've come compared to, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But, you can, unless you tell the whole story, it's always going to be just more whitewashing. So in order to tell the whole story, you have to talk about the kinds of policies and laws that the federal government and state governments have imposed on Native people that led to, that have this impulse to eliminate our existence.
Well, and I would argue still exist. I mean, this push for assimilation is something that obviously has a lot of ugly history to it, but it's also a very contemporary push. I mean, again, if I were to consider what a school would teach, they would obviously do the same Pocahontas, Happy Little Pilgrims thing, but they would also, if they were going to try to contemporize that at all, what they would praise is the effectiveness of assimilation. They throw a Jim Thorpe winning a medal for the United States, or they talk about code talkers or the high enlistment rate, or they would cite, look at there's Deborah Haaland is the Interior Secretary. So they would throw all of these examples of how successful assimilation is, and as much as they'd want to talk about enlistment rate, they aren't going to in the military. They aren't going to talk about the folks at Standing Rock fighting against militarized police. They aren't going to talk about those of us who are pushing for land back, those of us who are trying to expose the horrors of residential schools. None of that stuff would fit into these pro-mascot, anti-critical race theory folks.
Right. And they're not going to talk about the system of federal Indian law that maintains this relationship of domination with things like the doctrine of discovery, the trust doctrine, the doctrine of domestic dependent nationhood, because it's the legal system that is the problem. That maintains the scaffolding of the impulse to eliminate Native peoples and nations. So, and this is the core of it. But it's paradoxical, right? Because on the one hand, you have this systemic and structural, impulse to eliminate Native people. But on the other hand, like the way we talk about it in academic terms about how settler colonialism is always, it's the structure of the system that we all live in. But on the other hand, it's always unfinished because Native people are constantly resisting it. So that's the thing. Like, you have to talk about both things. So, I don't know. I wanted to talk about, like, kind of while we're on the topic of sports and change and transformation. I don't know if you have been seeing my posts, but for this last week, the stuff about surfing and surf culture. And what we're seeing is we are making the work that we're doing, the work that I've been doing for years now, is producing serious transformational change in the culture. And surfing as a sport it's a lifestyle sport. And so that means that it's actually like a subculture. So not only is it just this thing that people do for enjoyment, people attach their identities to it. And surfing has a long, very painful history as being a tool of colonization, both in Hawaii and in California. And so, and the way that the history has been written for a century has been very twisted, very whitewashed, very sanitized. And so, we live, and the sport itself happens on lands and in spaces of ethnic cleansing, especially here in California, and in places like California and in the East Coast. The erasure of it always begins with the erasure of Indigenous people. And so these settler narratives, the condition of possibility is the disappearance of Native people. And the same is true with surf culture. Surf culture has been based on it, it's the context for it. And surfing is so white. It's so white in its makeup and the people that do it. Historically, that when I first started writing about this stuff and talking about it here over 10 years ago, people would laugh at me. They would mock me and ridicule me for saying these things. But now we're at a point, we're at this inflection point, this historical moment, because of all these circumstances have led up to a moment here where we are seeing real changes, or at least an opening in people's attitudes where they're willing to hear hard truths.
Well, part of it's acknowledging the first off is acknowledging the conflict. I mean, even as you're talking about surfing, I can't help but compare it to a little bit to what's happening with lacrosse and the fact that trying to even put a native team in some of these international play has become more and more difficult because it is, essentially this is a sport, a native sport that's been taken over by universities and frankly other countries. And so, I mean, it makes it very, very difficult for native people unless they jump in their ship completely. I mean, look, I understand that surfing was a part of the Olympics this year, but I dare say try to get native people to be able to represent their people in some of this international in these international competitions, and it's almost impossible. You were either going to be Team Canada, you're going to be Team Mexico, or you're going to be Team United States. You're not going to be anything else.
The whole system is founded on a colonial framework,
Mm-hmm.
right? That privileges the state system. But let me tell you, in the World Surfing League, so the World Surfing League, the WSL, is the hub of the industry of surfing and controls global competitive surfing. For years, they have allowed Hawaiian competitors to surf under the Hawaiian flag. So Hawaii is granted nation status in the World Surf League system. So when, I don't know if you saw the story, but when the Olympics happened this year, Carissa Moore, who is, she's the top women surfer, and she went into the Olympics as that, and a 4-time world champion. And so she goes into the Olympics and she won the Olympics, but there was some press about the fact that they fought to get Hawaii to have its own standing as a nation. Of course, they were denied.
Right.
And so somebody wrote an article about that. And, they got a quote from Carissa Moore, and she talked about how, it puts the athletes in a really, like her, in an uncomfortable position as somebody who's a native Hawaiian, like a Hawaiian nationalist. As a competitor, it's a very tough choice for a person like that, an athlete, to take a hard political stand. And so she mentioned that it was in this HuffPost article that she was disappointed by it, but she didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. And she said, I'm just happy to be here, in this, in the Olympics for the first time. She goes on to win the gold medal. But then you see Bill Maher. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I didn't. He just pisses me off.
I can't stand him. But you leave it to him to pick up on that. He's so racist.
Oh yeah.
And when it comes to native people, he is blind.
I actually stopped watching. I really couldn't watch his program anymore because there's no retort. There's never an opportunity for somebody to really push back on some of the racist stuff that he says. So I can imagine how he dealt with this.
He's not willing really to change his mind, although he seems to have become less racist toward Black people because he's been called out on it.
Luckily, there's still a bunch of us that he can still go after, right?
Right. So, but the point still remains. So anyway, he did this new rules thing that he does.
Yeah.
And he picked up on that HuffPost article, and he mocked it. Like, what? Since when is cultural appropriation? And how do we know that surfing began? And it's just bullshit stuff that he says. And so he just perpetuated this whole line that just makes him come off looking like a racist and anti-indigenous. So,
and don't leave out misogynist either, because, he also has a tendency to really call down women all the time as well.
I don't watch him enough to even know, because I can't stand him. I think he's just the liberal version of Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. I agree.
When Bill O'Reilly does it, it's disgusting, and when Bob Maher does it, it's disgusting. This politics of disrespect. Fuck that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, that's fine. This is a podcast. We can get away with that kind of thing.
But my point about all of this is that the energy is moving in a certain direction, right? And it's only a matter of time. And who knows what's going to be possible in the realm of international sport with the Iroquois nationals, and playing under the Iroquois flag. So I don't discount anything. At this point, I think the world is there's so much change happening that it's only a matter of time. I mean, I'm going to be optimistic and say that it's only a matter of time, because they're going to keep pushing back and they're not going to stop.
Well, and that's the way I take the whole mascot issue, as I get called in, various schools to help in the conversation, and I always begin with, it's inevitable. Whatever you've been doing for 80 years is not going to continue. So the question is, do you want to try to dig in and then, cast your community or even put your students, your kids in these circumstances? I mean, accept the inevitable fate that mockery and appropriation of Native imagery for your non-Native entertainment and amusement is not acceptable. And let's move on. I mean, and we can still teach more history. We can still teach that Native people still exist. It's not an either or thing. Well, we're going to keep the mascot and add some things to our curriculum, or we get rid of the mascot and then you make Native people disappear. I argue that the existence of Native mascots has more erasure involved in it than removing Native mascots. And I always come back to, how much does a white person have to do, or how much do white people have to ignore to accept or to appropriate Native imagery as their own? I mean, think about how much history. I mean, one of the things I always bring up, which is probably the best example of history being ignored, is Abraham Lincoln's execution order for the Mankato, Minnesota execution, the Dakota 38. And the fact that execution takes place the day after Christmas in 1862, which is about a week and a couple of days before the Emancipation Proclamation comes into law. I mean, if you can't tell the story of Abraham Lincoln signing that execution order in the same, that happens within the execution happens the same week, essentially, as the Emancipation Proclamation, then you're doing a disservice to even calling yourself a history teacher.
Well, yeah, but how many history teachers even know that history?
Well, and a part of it, there's ignorance, and then there's willful ignorance. So, and that's the other challenge. And you look, there are folks like you who are doing the good work. I mean, folks like Roxanne and those of us doing podcasts on radio shows. Look, we're always trying to educate people. And one of the things that I hear most especially when I do live events where it's somewhat interactive, is I hear people say, I can't believe that I have been betrayed by my education in such a way. They'll tell me how many masters or PhDs they have, and yet I'm telling them something they've never heard before, like Lincoln or L. Frank Baum's genocide editorials or whatever. And look, I think about where you're at right now, and I know I've been in the area where you've got folks like Hunapera Sarah's name plastered on the highways and stuff like that. And how, if you're in California, how do you not tell the true history of somebody who has now been canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church, for crying out loud?
Sarah's days are numbered too. Because even though the Catholic Church, the so-called progressive Pope, right, who refused to not canonize Sarah because for whatever reason, I mean, who knows? Like that's mystifying to me. Like, the history is what it is, and it's very well documented how, Sarah's role in the enslavement and, extreme population decline of California and the abuse of California Indians. I mean, it's unforgivable.
And he's from South America, this existing Pope. So he is more familiar with that history than perhaps, any previous Pope.
Yeah. And so it's mind-boggling to me that that he himself has dug in, and refused to not canonize Sarah. But um, it's just it's only I think it's a matter of time. I mean, here in California, like, one thing that happened was, so we have in the California legislature is the only California Indian ever elected to it. His name is James Ramos. He's from San Manuel. He's the former chairman of San Manuel, and he had been fighting. He's been fighting the Sarah issue, and for years, just like a lot of California Indians. And last year, when the George Floyd thing happened and all those statues were being ripped down, like the Confederate statues, and then also the colonial monuments were being ripped down, one of them was the statue of Sarah at the state capitol. So this, on the grounds of the state capitol, was this monument to Sarah, like the holy priest or whatever. And so they took him down, and of course the Catholics were pretty upset about it. But James Ramos shortly thereafter introduced a bill into the legislature, AB 338, that basically would prevent the replacing of that statue with another statue of Sarah. And that bill passed, and just within the past couple of weeks. And so that's a bit of progress. So now it will be illegal for the Sarah statue on the grounds of the state capitol to be replaced. That's a little bit of progress right there.
Now, I wonder, was the argument more tied to a separation of church and state, or towards the actual atrocities that he committed?
Toward the atrocities. I'm not even aware of the argument of separation of church and state even entering the conversation. So it's just really about, the history is well established. And so now give California Indians a say in this. And what will happen is that monument will be replaced by a monument honoring California Indians. If you look at, we could take it all the way back to, the mid 1800s and the abolition of slavery, when, people fought for the abolition of slavery and they got the Emancipation Proclamation. You start getting rights for Black people, but it's at the same time that Native people are being slaughtered on their homelands. So there's some very uncomfortable places where those things intersect. But eventually, Native people start fighting for their rights because Native people's issues are not the same as Black issues. They're not. They're different. And so you start seeing these differences, in the turn of the century, early 20th century. Native people formed Society for American Indians, and they're talking about the protection of lands. They're talking about freedom of religion. They're talking about the stopping of the allotment process and the boarding schools, like all these things that are particularly Indigenous issues. So it starts there in the 20th century. Then mid 20th century, we see, the Black rights, the fight for civil rights for Black people. That starts really gaining traction, first with Martin Luther King and, the nonviolence movement, and then later with the Black Panthers. And so we see the rise of AIM as on the heels of the Black Panthers, because they're influenced by it, right? And so I think that that pattern is being repeated, but just like with the earlier movements, the American Indian movement were articulating something completely different than the Black Panthers were articulating. It was something completely different. Honor the treaties, leave us alone. Like Vine Deloria wrote in his book in 1968, Custer Died for Your Sins. Like what he said in that book, in 1968, and he had this whole analysis, a whole chapter on it, talking about the difference between what indigenous people want, what, Indians want versus what Black people want. And he was very clear about it, and it was very critical. He was like, we're not fighting for the same thing. What we need is a national leave us alone agreement. Like, leave us alone. Like, Black people are fighting for full inclusion into the state. Native people have never fought for that.
I didn't realize how much Frederick Douglass had subscribed to the whole manifest destiny.
I know.
And as I'm reading more and more, I realize what an enemy to Native people guys like Frederick Douglass were. I mean, so you're right. We are not fighting for the same thing.
The same thing is happening right now, like since the George Floyd thing. And this is the work that I'm focusing on right now, is saying, like, when we do this diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI work in our social spaces, in our educational spaces, we have to stop. There has to be an understanding that conflating Native people with, other ethnic minority communities who are fighting for full inclusion and rights in the state, it's not changed.
I'm glad you're saying all this, because this is a point that I find isn't made strongly enough. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't be allies with each other. I mean, and that's the other thing. It's just because we're not fighting for the same thing doesn't mean we can't support each other's fight.
Exactly.
And I think that's also one of the challenges. Look, I was glad to see somebody like Colin Kaepernick take the argument beyond just the police violence against Black people, and then throw out the numbers about how much death by cop is a problem, for Native people. And he went to Alcatraz, and we haven't had enough recognizable celebrity type Black athletes step up. It hasn't
been reciprocal. You see Native people, fighting for Black Lives Matter, but it's not reciprocated on the same level. The Black rights movement supporting Native issues. Like, there's a disconnect there. And so I think that's something, because it's really touchy. It's really delicate to talk about these things, like how we need each other. But, if what you're fighting for is inclusion into the state, we have to have hard conversations about settler colonialism and what the state is and its relationship to Native people, and what does that mean for everybody that wants that, supports that, these state structures. Like, we have to have their hard conversations.
Yeah, and they involve everything from jurisdictional issues to to obviously the challenges that we face with child services and so many of these other things. I mean, health and all that other stuff. But I think
we have a thing here in California right now, this high profile news story in Manhattan Beach about this place called Bruce's Beach. And this is a story about how a Black family had bought some property, some beachfront, prime real estate, beachfront property, owned this property, and then California, with its own segregation policies, because it happened here, this family they got their property taken away from them. And so the descendants of that family have been fighting to get that property back, because they say they stole it from us. Right. And so this is really high profile, and like, nobody where's the conversation about how do you people, your family, how did they come to even have this property that was stolen property from Native people? But like, that conversation is not being had.
Well, and I got to ask you, what's your thoughts on how much religion creeps into all of this? Because I mean, one of the things that we oftentimes run up against is the influence that the church has had on both the Black community and, frankly, in many Native communities. I mean, I saw the Choctaw Nation passed a resolution a year or so ago declaring that the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma was a Christian nation. It's like, really?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a critical question, and the influence of Christianity is still with us, unfortunately. I mean, colonization through Christianization was
hand in hand. Yeah.
Well, it is. Yeah, right. It's all they are. They were complicit with each other. One needed the other. The state processes of colonization needed Christianity for that to happen, and all that brainwashing, all that trauma that was what's that
Imposed, I
word?
mean, yeah,
Imposed.
yeah, on
Right.
native children even, yeah.
Yeah, and we're still working through that. I mean, if you think about how in Black communities, how it's really Christianity that helps them cope with slavery, right? People who have been taken out of their own homelands, forced to new places, abused, for centuries. They find hope, they find resilience, they find survival through their church organizations, through those fellowships, and through the religion itself. And it evolves into this very cultural kind of thing, gospel and all of that stuff.
And yet the church played such a significant role in the institution of slavery. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, but I mean, it's mystifying to me. But
Yeah.
I guess that's if that's all you got. I mean, and I know that not all Black people fighting for Black liberation are Christians. I know that. But the vast majority of them seem to be.
Well, and I also find that there's that for those that we are either working on or working against, sometimes the church can be the place that that's the bridge too far for them. And look, I can't help but bring up somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, when I think about a woman, even though she was Jewish, the idea that she would cite the doctrine of Christian discovery in the Oneida case out here, as the footnote, and basically her footnote number one, and then cite some of these other doctrines that are tied to that, legal doctrines that are tied to the doctrine of Christian discovery. It amazes me, because you would think, and as you know, the liberal left is always praising Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a champion for all of these rights, women's rights in particular. The language associated with the city of Sherrill versus Oneida is devastating, and it's coming from somebody who we would think would know better, right?
I know, but and she came back. It was either in her book or an article, but she did say she regretted it. And but it goes to show you how a lawyer can reach to the highest level of the American courts and still not know, and still have no historical perspective, or what I think it's having not an incomplete historical analysis of the relationship between the state and American Indians. It's just taken for granted that Native people, because if you unpack all of that, it's Native people were savages. They needed to be assimilated. They needed to be civilized. And that's that. Right. And so that's the only way that you can justify something like the doctrine of discovery. But the vast majority, I mean, it's the vast majority of all people who go through American law schools never take a course on Indian law.
And yet you can't find any place in any of in any study of law where there was a legitimate transfer of sovereignty from Native people. And and look, even with the doctrine of Christian discovery, which argues that our sovereignty was necessarily diminished upon discovery, we know that there's language in things like the Canandaigua Treaty where the United States says we recognize the land is yours and we will never claim the same. So we know that there's contradiction. But you're right. All these folks who study law will never confront that contradiction.
I get invited to talks once in a while to legal groups. Gave a talk to a group of appellate court state judges in Washington State earlier this year. And it used to be intimidating for me to talk as somebody, a non-legal person, but somebody who has a pretty good grasp of the history and the foundations of federal Indian law. It used to be really intimidating and scary, but it's not anymore, because I know a lot more than they do. And so I can speak to these issues and contextualize these issues, with the history, and it's irrefutable. Like, because they know they can't contest it.
Well, and one of the things that I find interesting is that when you talk about the fact that this doesn't get confronted properly, one of the things that I can't help but bring up is, of all of the judges on the Supreme Court, it was Clarence Thomas who raised a different argument in a case called U.S. v. Lara. If you ever get a chance to look at it, it's U.S. v. Lara. It's Lara, and
Yeah.
it's a case. Are you familiar with it at all?
Yeah, it's just one of them. I can't say I remember what the
Well,
case is about.
what it's about is that it was a guy who was beating up his wife. He was a native from one territory. She was from another. There was a restraining order against him. He shows up there, gets into a scuffle with a bunch of tribal police. He gets charged with assaulting a tribal officer, serves 90 days. Then the feds come back and they charge him with assaulting a federal officer because one of them, or I guess one or more were BIA officers. And so he tried to argue that the double jeopardy laws should apply, but he couldn't be charged twice for the same crime. And so it was a weird thing where you had the U.S. prosecutor arguing that sovereignty was what laid at the foundation of tribal police and tribal courts, not granting full faith and credit from the federal government. So you had the U.S. attorney arguing in favor of sovereignty, and you had the native guy arguing against it because of his own self-interest. But it was Clarence Thomas who raised questions about whether this idea that Congress was granted power in the Constitution to regulate the metes and bounds of tribal sovereignty. But what he was arguing was that there was no foundation in the Constitution, including citing the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. There was actually nothing in there that grants that does anything to really grant that power to Congress. And what he said was that needs to be addressed. I mean, now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that he was pro-sovereignty. I think he wants some mechanism put in place to put this to rest, because he says from a legal framework, there's nothing that solidifies the U.S. position. He said the court has been schizophrenic, is what he said in his ruling. But of all people, you would have thought that would have come from one of the liberal justices, but it doesn't. And the only reason I brought religion into that conversation, because I think somewhere along the line, I think something outside of law is what guides some of these folks, and whether it's their religious beliefs or just whatever you want to call it, their indoctrination culturally, it actually weighs higher, even with these Supreme Court justices, than the body of law that they're supposed to be considering.
No, I agree, and I think it's so deeply embedded and unconscious in the social landscape and the American mind, and that's because it's there. The legitimization of the entire system rests on not having to go there. Like I mean, the because it doesn't square. Like, the narratives of freedom, justice, and democracy, but the historical reality of genocide and indigenous elimination, they don't square. And the lies about American freedom and democracy went out at the expense of telling the truth, and that's a problem of legitimization. So, like, the state, the U.S. as a state founded on these principles, is really not true. And so it really has to be it becomes a process of legitimizing foreign presence on indigenous lands. I mean, that's ultimately the bottom line. Like, that's the you can't distill it down any further than that, right? That people come here, they violently take the land in all these ways, and then they have to justify and rationalize that taking in the name of democracy and freedom. And in order to do that, you have to sidestep all of this other stuff. And I think that's so habitual, it's so structural and systemic, that people don't even know they're doing it. They don't even know that the system is formed that way.
Well, the only pushback I'll give to that is that you hear it in many times with the arguments, especially at the Supreme Court, where they almost don't want to address the facial challenges that are in front of them, right? Because they're more concerned about the repercussions that it has, the more long-standing and far-reaching repercussions. That tells me that they do know. And so rather than, like you said, don't go there, that's exactly what's happened with a lot of these cases. So you have a situation where courts don't want to address these issues because they understand in order for them to really uphold their so-called system of law, they have to create a real problem going forward. And obviously this is always brought up when it comes to land claims. But again, I go back to somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Oneida case. She cites, both the system of latches, but also the doctrine of impossibility. And what she said was the doctrine of impossibility was that it was impossible for us to ever reassert jurisdiction on lands that we had lost, no matter how we had lost them, through fraud, theft, whatever, that for us to reclaim and reacquire lands and then assert our jurisdiction on it. She said that represents the doctrine of impossibility, which is an absurd legal proposition.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
It's absurd. I mean, you got to put a name, but that's part of what these people are trained to do. They have they've taken oaths to the Constitution. They have taken oaths to uphold the American system. And so that's what they're doing unconsciously or consciously. They are not tasked with taking a hard look at the system and how it comes to be that way. Because, we can speculate about why, but, their job is to, and it's partially the problem of Western positivist law and the principle of stare decisis, let the decision stand, right? So, they pick and choose when they want. They will overturn some precedents when they want. They overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. They overturned the Dred Scott decision, right? When they did the Board versus, Brown versus Board and, all of those kinds of civil rights decisions. But they don't do the same thing with native rights Indian rights cases. And, so you have to, Robert Williams, of course, calls that racist. I don't know that I would use that word. But I think it's colonialist.
Well,
right?
and again, I think that's a tough one to parse, where colonialism is not directly tied to racism, but clearly you are talking about a people believing that their superiority entitles them the right to treat people lesser than them. That's the definition of racism. So I think that's
upholding that system. You got to uphold that system at all costs.
Right. Well, and that kind of brings me back to really what. Where we start the conversation. And when I look at what schools, and now we're talking about grade schools, not just high schools, and we're not even talking about college here. We're talking about the most formative years of a human being's life, their upbringing, regardless what these children experience at home, how they are being formed and imprinted in school with things not even just the mascot issue, but even the way history is taught and the things that are said to these children. I look in a history book; they still have the Pocahontas saving John Smith's life in a textbook today. The textbooks are still being used today, and of course, we know that that's not a true story. And it's misrepresented in so many different ways. And yet, this is the imprint that these children are faced with. I tell a story sometimes about going to an opening of a business incubator close to the Seneca Nation territory here, and one of the high-level officials from the Department of Commerce was introduced to one of the more prominent Seneca business persons. And when he was introduced to him, he said, "Oh, what do you deal in? Beads and leather?" I mean, so this is a grown man, college educated, who's been serving in a governmental position for all of these years, and he has this limited level of knowledge about what Native people are today, but that's all born.
Don't you think there's underneath all of that is a certain contempt?
Well, yes, I do, but I think that contempt becomes so easy to exude, I guess, because there is, again, we talk about racism. It's this idea that they could look down on somebody in such a way that even as they bring up a comment like this, they don't even have to consider it.
To validate their existence.
Right. Exactly.
Period.
But I mean,
that's what it comes down to.
But if kids are being constantly reinforced with the same idea that we either don't exist anymore, that we are only objects of the past, it makes it that much more of a challenge. Because, like I said, when I do have the opportunity to tell somebody or teach somebody something that they've never learned before, I mean, I can see in their faces, especially when I'm in a crowd, and I'm sure you've done plenty on the lecture circuit. You can almost see when you've said something to somebody that they've never heard before or never even considered, that it's not just what you said, it's how much it impacts everything else that they've been taught, that they start to feel. And I've seen it in the faces of people.
Oh yeah. I see it in the classroom every day. In teaching college classes, I've become accustomed to the ire of students feeling anger that they're, for the first time, knowing that they've been lied to their whole lives. Like, this is very common that, in our classes, our American Indian Studies classes, they know that they become aware that they've been lied to their whole life when they get confronted with the real truth of things, and they're pissed.
Yeah. Well, and certainly, when and I think the avoidance to address, slavery as the main cause for like the Civil War is a real perfect example of that. But certainly, I mean, look, I know, and I participated in them, and I know you've done them before. This idea of doing land acknowledgements, I see the value in it. But, I know if we're talking about doing a land acknowledgement in some place like New York or in Manhattan, how do you do the land acknowledgement without acknowledging the massacres that took place on that land? And I think about the Dutch killing the Lenape right there in the 1600s. And it's not enough to do the land acknowledgement if we don't acknowledge what happened to the people who either were from there or what's happened to them as they try to maintain a presence on that land. I think land acknowledgement has to go beyond saying who used to live here.
Right. No, I totally agree. And this is what we've been doing in the World Surf League. So just this week, we've been confronting all of these issues, and I will actually be working with them to do some serious re-education around this, because we're going to keep doing this in other places. They wanted to do this is a long story, but originally they wanted to just do land acknowledgements. But the conversation has evolved over the past few years to, this is not just land acknowledgement. This is about acknowledging the fact. This is about respecting living communities, bringing them here. It's great to do opening ceremony. So we created these opening ceremony, and they're going to do a closing ceremony. This is all happening right now, right this week, because the World Championships are right now, and it's in the town where I live. So we did these opening ceremonies. We had our elders of the Hashiman community here have been treated with the utmost respect. And I'm the mediator for all of this, for these actions. And I have said to this organization, commercial organization, I have said that if you want to have this relationship, because they said, we want to have a relationship with the Native people. And I said, okay, great. Then if you want to have a relationship, you have to give back. You have to do something. You have to show your respect in a tangible way. And unfortunately, or not, I mean, the limitations are, financial, they're fiscal. And so, they have pledged a gift, a financial gift that will have substantial meaning for that community, for this local Native community. And so that's a real step in the right direction right there. And if we can maintain, if they can institutionalize, if the WSL can institutionalize these values, institutionalize the knowledge of the history of what happened here and how we got to this point and how disrespectful the whole thing is, These are all little baby steps that we can take on a grander scale to create more meaningful systemic change.
Well, and I think land acknowledgement has to also acknowledge things like land back, the effort that Native people are having to reacquire land, but also, and I think about like radio and television and theater and film and so much. It's not enough to do land acknowledgement if we're not being provided space within some of these things that may not be physical spaces, but they may be spaces in the airwaves or on the internet. We do need to have a space for our voices and our presence to be acknowledged, not just that we used to exist.
Yeah, but one thing leads to another, right? And so one step leads to another. Native people, the only reason we have survived is because we just kept going, we just kept pushing, and it's no different now than it was before. Our own knowledge about history, our own arguments, our own all of this stuff is more sophisticated than ever. We know how to fight with the tools of the colonizer. We know their language. We know how they think, and that's what it's required for us to accomplish anything. For us to simply survive and maintain what little land bases we have now. So we just keep moving forward and become educated in their systems and use their systems to our advantage.
Thank you, Dina, for joining me on Let's Talk Native. As always, if you like what you hear, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. You can follow the show on Twitter at Let's Talk Native, and you can also follow us on Instagram at Let's Talk Native TV, and you can join our Facebook group page. I am John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
Yo, we still was standing rock before I had a name. To erase the identity, all the names have changed. But it don't matter where you are or where you stand. The fact remains that this is still native land. The tragedies are listed in history. How justice still hasn't been served remains a mystery. Blood flows from the schools to the slaughter, to the missing and murdered mothers and daughters. The war club was handed down for centuries. It had a purpose, but fulfilled that eventually. But now instead of violence and casualties, I slay injustice with my mic ever so casually. But we can't even live, we can't even heal. New day, old wounds, same medicine wheel. If I tell you my pain, show you my scars, I hope you see.